Good morning, almost good afternoon. This is a brief lecture to my introduction to music class. I wanted to share with them some thoughts on where we're at right now and where we're going, as a matter of fact. But first of all, I've given you a lesson on the early Romantic period. And talking about the Romantic period of music, I divided it into two parts. The early Romantic, which you've looked at this week, several composers. And this week I'm also going to post some material for the late Romantic. Now, this being Thanksgiving, I'm going to post this material, but I'm going to let it run until next week, probably the latter part of the week. So you'll take some time off for Thanksgiving, Thursday and Friday this weekend. But if you want to get started, if you're one of those, I guess, say overachievers, you can get it done before Thanksgiving. But I'm not going to expect anything, and I'm not going to post anything new until later next week. After that, we have 20th century music, and we may or may not have one more section. I've got to look. Officially, this class ends on the 14th of December, which means the last lesson would be the week of the 7th. But the week of the 7th is also when your research papers are due. And I wanted to make mention today, here at the beginning, that I'm still missing artist essays, or pardon me, not artist essays, but some listening assignments from a lot of folks. And so you need to get those in as soon as possible. Pardon me for messing with the camera. But also your research paper has to be in by the 7th. Now, that week of the 7th may be sort of a get everything together. I'm looking at doing a brief thing on pop music then, but I may take that week just to get our assignments in, because some of you that may see this video, you need to check. I think I've got all the grades that I have posted on Blackboard. So if you're looking at an assignment and you think, well, I turned that in, why is the grade not there? There's a good chance that I didn't get it. That happens, particularly on Blackboard. Sometimes people will post things on Blackboard, but I think I've caught up with all of that. I'd prefer you send it to me by email. But for those assignments that don't show up on the Blackboard Grade Center, you need to resubmit those if you've done them. If you haven't done them, you need to get them to me as soon as possible. Some of you have been working on recent work and you've forgotten about previous work. So let this be a heads up to you. And I may send this out or send a email to the facilitators at Chester and Louisville and Great Falls showing what work is missing so that you can get started on that. But today I want to back up a little bit because I didn't really get the intro video I was planning on posting about the early Romantic. Now, the early Romantic we usually say starts around 1820. Beethoven will die in 1827, so he had one foot in the classical and one foot in the Romantic period. He is what we call a bridge composer, and you may have seen that on your test already. But this period is a reaction. Remember I told you about the pendulum, how history seems to swing back and forth from conservative ideology to liberal ideology. That's what we'd call it today. In the early days, you would have we'd call it sacred and secular. The Renaissance period was a secular period, but the Baroque was a sacred period. Classical period was more of a sacred. But now we move into the Romantic, which is, well, I said that wrong, by the way. The classical is more of a secular period too, also. The Romantic period is not necessarily a sacred period because the church has lost a lot of its influence. It's not totally out of the picture, but what we get into now is from secular to secular humanism. And humanism is still a big philosophy during this period. The very first slide, I'm looking over at my computer, I mentioned Emmanuel Kant. He's a guy who gave us some wonderful ideas on morality, but also reason versus morality. I won't go into that a great deal, but I just want you to understand that this guy and a guy named Wilhelm Hegel were some of the big people as far as directing thought. In this, the next slide we talk about from faith to reason, reason to full self-centered consciousness, from self to being, to non-being, to Darwin, to evolution. All these things are going about in the Romantic, all through the Romantic. You had Karl Marx and individualism in the community. And a lot of people misunderstand Marx. He wrote the Communist Manifesto, but his was really more of a utopian idea. And Darwin was there doing something similar. It will be Lenin in the 1900s that will probably turn it into what we consider the communist idea, but we won't talk about that today. There was the Age of Reason and existentialism in the classical period, but now we come into a new thing, this fascination with the supernatural, not just the natural. We'll see that too, in that people are more concerned about spirituality, not necessarily religion, but spiritism, and that becomes a big theme. The other thing is where you had the idea of the brotherhood of man in classicism, that swings to the other side. The pendulum swings there. And now you have a rise in narcissism, named after the Greek person Narcissus, who fell in love with his own image. That narcissism will sort of manifest itself later on, thanks to Hegel, into this idea of we're narcissistic about ourselves, and then we expand that to our culture. And you have this socialistic idea, and pardon me, not socialistic, but nationalistic idea that, you know, we are superior because we're this nation. That will bloom all the way into fascism later, when we see Nazi Germany rise up and say, well, the Nazis are superior because of our breeding, our bloodline, things like that. But it's not just socialism in Russia, or communism, I should say, or fascism in Germany. It's everywhere you have national pride. Today, it's interesting that people condemn this because they immediately link it to fascism, but that's not the only thing. There's a lot of ways of looking at national pride, and you shouldn't look at it as just so terrible. It is perverted. Adolf Hitler perverted the nationalism, the fascist idea, which, by the way, fascism is a form of socialism, if you didn't know. But he perverted that into saying that Germans are superior, Aryan bloodlines are superior, and he took it all the way to the horrors of the Holocaust. Well, in America, our nationalism was, we felt like American freedom was superior, and we wanted to export that freedom to the world. We still talk about exporting freedom, but we have socialist and liberalism in this country that says, oh, we shouldn't do that. You know, we're evil for being proud of our country. And it's caused a lot of struggles. And globally, a lot of countries have moved toward democratic socialism, and a lot of people in this country want us to go that route too. This is not politics, though, but I just want you to know this is where all this sort of begins to ferment. Now, on the music scene in the Romantic area, you have what we call Romanticism, and the definition I have here is it's just a stress on emotion and expression, whereas the early classicists were looking at the idea of form and logic. Here we get all the way into emotion. Logic sort of takes a back seat. The composers are talking about, how do I express the way I feel? And they did it a couple of different ways. I mentioned narcissism, this fascination at the turn of the century with the occult, with spiritism, with supernatural stuff. All that comes about. This is when Mary Shelley will write Frankenstein, which if you've seen the movie, you know Frankenstein, but if you read the book, you understand it better, because Frankenstein was almost a sort of a religious idea where you have the creator, or the monster, seeking to understand and be one with, I said that backwards again, the creation, which was the monster, seeking the creator, which was the doctor. And that was sort of a metaphor for man's struggle to constantly, find God. Then you had other things. I was looking here to mention a couple of these books like Ivanhoe, which went the other direction. It turned the simple idea of knighthood from, looking at guys running around bashing heads into this noble idea. that the knights, that might equals right, and you have the Camelot idea. Walter Scott wrote Ivanhoe, and that's where we get our idea of what knights were. But in reality, it was quite different. Some other things like Victor Hugo writes The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Charles Dickens writes the Christmas Carol. Both of these are a little less than what you think, because The Hunchback of Notre Dame was a slap at the church. If you've ever read it, or again seen some of the movies, except for the Disney version, that's different. But it's basically taking this grotesque human being, and the church sort of punishes him for being human, and it shows him as being grotesque. And the church in that is the bad guy, and that was a slap at the church. That's what this socialistic, narcissistic idea says, leave me alone, I am who I am, God made me this way, all that sort of stuff. A Christmas Carol is interesting because we think of it as Dickens' Christmas Carol, but when you analyze it, it's really a ghost story, and it goes along with this idea of supernatural. The fascination with the supernatural led to a fascination with nature. And the change that occurs toward the middle to late part of this will be the Industrial Revolution, which takes everything and turns it upside down. I mentioned Edgar Allan Poe, just an example of the poetry. Poe was an interesting guy, a very melancholy type of guy. But he touched on the internal search and also for the supernatural idea in some of his poetry. I think he would have been an interesting person. You read the slide, you see his letter of resignation from the army, which I thought was humorous. He just went in, spent a couple of years. When he got tired of it, he thought, well, I'm ready to go. Didn't realize the army didn't work that way. I make a mention on slide number 7 about contemporary connections and about how at the turn of the century things changed. And today we're seeing something very similar to this. Going from the 1700s to the 1800s, there was a rise in communication skills, personal wealth, greater access to technology, this fascination with the supernatural, also the spirit of individualism. And that's very much of what we saw in going from the 1900s to 2000s. Same thing. There's a rise of computers, technology, information, and still there was this fascination with the supernatural, still is. So there's something to be said for this on a comparative basis. But what I do want you to realize is that a lot of scholars believe that we started the Romantic period around the 1800s, and we never got out of it. We are still in a form of Romanticism today. So we saw periods last, almost 1,000 years in the Middle Ages, and then they started getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and all of a sudden now we get the Romantic. We're back to 200 years, and it doesn't look like we're going to change anytime soon. But that's reflected in the music. Now, in the music of the early Romantic and all the way into the late Romantic, you have this search for emotions. You have, to express it, you had people like Beethoven who took the piano keyboard and used every note. If you analyze Mozart, for instance, he stayed pretty much in the center of the keyboard. He wasn't drastic until later on, as he began to take on some of this Romantic influence. But Beethoven, he was all over the place, a wide range of pitch, dynamics, loud and soft. These are the ways they express it. There was also the stress on individual style. Each composer was looking for his way to offer something new. Then I mentioned nationalism as a theme. One of the biggest things to remember about Romanticism as far as symphony work is program music. We had the classical symphony following sonata form, but now we take that form and we add some meat to the bones by simply saying that now with music, what we want to do is to express ourselves and to reflect what we see. And so nature being one of the themes, composers began literally just to look out their window and they'd see a tree or they'd see a river or they see a mountain, and they try to express that musically. And some great symphonies come out of that. Schubert wrote an entire symphony and he gave it a programmatic title. Instead of calling it Schubert's Symphony in C, 4-part movement, Opus 15, he'd say, this is the Trout. And so in the music, he tries to go all the way back to the idea of text painting when we were talking about words. Now they do mode painting or oral sound painting. And he tried to reflect a fish, a trout, jumping in the water, swimming in this symphony. One of my favorites programmatic pieces of music was written by a guy named Smetana, Czechoslovakian, and he based it on the river Volga, which ran through his country. And it is a perfect explanation or demonstration of program music. He starts off with a flute playing just a slight little melody as if this were the stream. And then another stream joins it, so he adds a clarinet harmonizing. And as he goes on and the stream turns into a creek and into a pond, into a river, he adds more instruments. They get deeper in sound to represent the depth. He has a Starry Night section. He has a section where it goes through the woods and you hear a hunting party. It goes through a village, you hear a wedding celebration. And finally it comes to the Black Sea where it empties out into an industrial sound and you get lots of crashing waves. But Smetana's work was really quite brilliant. He was interesting character that he was loved and hated. He was a patriot, rebel, and yet he was also disliked. But you can find that when you study him a little bit. But program music. Now, with this, with the Romantic period, one of the reasons I divided it into an early and late is because you had a lot of composers. Remember in the classical we talked about 3 composers. In the Baroque we really focused on 2. Well, here I've got over a dozen composers. And that's just in the early Romantic. I'm going to add on some late Romantic composers. And the reason being is more and more people were turning to the arts and to music, and it was becoming more and more a crowd-pleasing art form. We look at Schubert. Now, I put these guys in the order of their birth and how long they lived. But not all of them, rose to prominence in the early Romantic. Some of them, like Wagner, was born and I think in 1813, but he really wasn't famous till right before he died, in 59, I believe it was. But Schubert was a guy who wrote as much music as Mozart, but died earlier than Mozart, but didn't quite get the honor because he had some personal hang-ups, which you can read about. Hector Berlioz, French composer, probably the best French composer in the early part, wrote a thing called the Symphonie Fantastique, but his dad wanted him to be a surgeon. And every one of these people have fascinating stories which fit into this romantic idea. They want to do one thing, their parents want to do something else, or they want to do something and society blocks them. So it's amazing to read the stories about Berlioz. Felix Mendelssohn comes along, and he actually is more of a classical composer who, believe it or not, he's in the Romantic, writing classical style, goes all the way back to the Baroque and discovers Bach. And had he not discovered Bach, Bach may have been lost to us. But thanks to Mendelssohn, he brings Bach out of the Baroque through the classical, right into the Romantic. Then there's Robert Schumann and his wife Clara. Tragic story there. They loved each other, but he couldn't play as well as his wife. He wrote the music, she played it, and he was bitterly upset, even tried to commit suicide. His best friend Brahms came and took care of him. And then there's all this love story about Brahms fell in love with Clara and Clara fell in love with Brahms, but all they do is send letters back and forth, even though they were only like 30 yards away from each other. And then when Schumann died, Brahms says, I won't sully your reputation and make people think we were having an affair, because we weren't. And he said, I'll never speak to you again. He moved to Berlin and they never communicated again. So you have that tragic love story that people love. Then you have Franz Liszt, Smetana I mentioned, Johann Strauss the second, not the first, who was the famous waltz king, wrote the Blue Danube. Then you have Brahms again, who comes back, and even though he later does get married and has kids, there's always this story about him and Clara. And then I mentioned Wagner, who was born in the early Romantic, but really flowered in the late Romantic. But Wagner is a guy who is interesting. He was sort of an isolationist, a little bit like Beethoven, in that he was creative and a genius. But he's famous for writing 4 operas called the Ring Cycle. And he didn't want to perform just anywhere, so he built a theater, like Shakespeare built his theater. Wagner builds his own theater called Bayreuth. Even today, those operas are brought out, I think it's once every 5 years, and they perform all 4 of them. I said 5, 4 of them. And if you're curious about what they're about, the Tolkien Lord of the Rings movies that was so popular 2 years ago or whatever, this is the same story. He just tells it from a Germanic version. So Wagner, he gives us a lot of interesting things with his harmonies and the way he writes music. I like his version of Tristan and Isolde for the music in it, because it's about unrequited love, which he himself was suffering. He was married, but he fell in love with someone else, but they could never be together. And so he wrote Tristan and Isolde, which is the story, basically the King Arthur story about Lancelot falling in love with Guinevere, but in Tristan and Isolde, they can never be together. And so the whole music is about, I guess you'd say, love that's never fully explored. And so he develops this idea of writing music that ends on suspended chords and never really resolves, just like their love never resolved. That's one of his brilliances, I guess you'd say. Anyway, I take a little time through this slideshow, and we talk about Berlioz and Mendelssohn. We talk about all these guys, so you can read a little bit more about them. I do want to go back, though. I want to mention one thing. I always do this. When I was talking about Chopin, Chopin had this reputation, and today everybody says, oh, yeah, he was a great gay composer. Chopin wasn't gay. He lived with Aurore Dudevant. That's her name. I was trying to think of her name. But Aurore Dudevant didn't go by her name. She went by George Sand, because she was a writer who didn't get published as a woman, so she wrote her books and signed them as a man. And Chopin used to kid about how he was in love with George Sand, and everybody thought, oh, he must be gay. But his friends knew who George Sand was. It was his girlfriend, Aurore Dudevant. But now it's been passed down through history that he was gay. But he wasn't. He had a beautiful girlfriend. Oddly enough, they never got married. But she was with him right up until he died of tuberculosis. So that's another interesting story. He was good friends with Franz Liszt, who was probably the greatest virtuoso piano of the age. The interesting thing there was Chopin could write, but he couldn't play as good as Liszt. And Liszt could play, but he couldn't write as good as Chopin. So when the two got together, they tried to help each other. Chopin taught Liszt how to be a better composer, and he became a better composer. Unfortunately, Liszt couldn't give some of his talent to Chopin. So there was the tragedy there. But Liszt wrote some incredible music for the piano that's based on Hungarian gypsy stuff. And it's incredible. I've posted some samples. One of them is a rhapsody that's performed by a guy named Maxim. And Maxim tries to be Franz Liszt, who was this, he was like Dracula. He wore black everywhere. And everywhere he'd go, women would pass out and they'd throw him room keys and stuff. And he was the guy. We talked about Smetana and Strauss and Brahms. Then that takes you through the early Romantic, and most of you actually have finished that because I gave you a test on it and things like that. But then I wanted to see if I can pull this up. Well, I had another one about the late Romantic, and I wanted to mention it real fast. Here we go. Some of you haven't seen this yet. I'm going to post it, but I want to give you a heads up because what we've done is we've gone through the early Romantic with these composers I was telling you about. These guys, some of them, like I said, were born early, but they didn't get famous till later. We start this slideshow about the late Romantic with Wagner, and I talk about his ring cycle and stuff. And then we talk about a guy named Giuseppe Verdi. Verdi, again, was another interesting fellow. He tried to get into the Academy of Music and couldn't get in because they said he was too old. And in his frustration, he began to write operas. Turns out he wrote some of the best operas. The Italians loved it. He was made the national opera composer of Italy. And when he tried to retire, the people begged him not to retire. They actually came to his house with torches and begging him to join Parliament. And eventually he did go into politics before he retired. But Verdi, his operas are incredible, some of the greatest operas, but his inspiration, or pardon me, the person he inspired became even greater, and that's the guy that we talk about. His name is Giacomo Puccini. And Puccini will write some operas that Puccini's operas have been performed more than any other operas in history. Things like La Bohème, Turandot, those have the famous operas, Nessun Dorma, the arias, and Chegalita Manina is in there, and these are famous operas, arias that everybody sings. Tosca is one of my favorites. Turandot I like, it's a little long, but he also wrote an opera that I thought was sort of funny at first. It's called Fanciulla del West, which translates Girl of the Golden West. And it's sort of a cowboy story. It's the first spaghetti western because he takes a cowboy story and then turns it into an opera. And all his operas have the same storyline. You have a handsome young guy who goes into town, meets a beautiful young girl, and then some evil landlord or bartender or whoever owns stuff is in love with her, and they struggle, and eventually the handsome kid gets killed and the girl kills herself, and it's all tragic. But he did Madame Butterfly, another tragic opera. But anyway, Puccini will be the guy that everybody considers the greatest opera. Now, it's a struggle between Verdi, who is the greatest in Italy, and Puccini becomes the greatest in the world. And then Wagner's sitting over there saying, no, it's me. So you have this national idea. Wagner thought the German opera was better. Puccini and Verdi thought the Italian opera was better. The French thought that the French opera was better. So it's all over the place. And you have some British composers. What you don't have is a lot of American composers. Another interesting story that you'll run into is Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky was a Russian composer. He was part of what they call the Big Five Russian composers that did everything. But he goes to France, where he writes opera, ballet, all kinds of symphonic stuff. He struggles to show himself as masculine as the Russian sound, but he is secretly gay, and so he gets married to try to quell that rumor, because it was pretty bad. You could be executed for being gay in those days. He was only married for a couple of weeks, and his wife said, well, when she found out he was gay, she told everybody and put him in deep depression. He tried to commit suicide. And then out of nowhere, this countess comes up and she says, look, you just go write your music. I'll pay all your expenses. And she said, the only thing is we can never meet because it would ruin her reputation. But Countess von Meck, I think was her name, and Nadezhda Monbeck. And so they did that until he became so popular. People said, well, forget if he's gay. His music is just too good. And then she stopped giving him anything, and they never spoke. They never really met. It's an interesting story. But Tchaikovsky, he's one of my favorite symphonic composers because his music does have a depth of emotion that a lot of guys, they didn't quite get there, but Tchaikovsky did. After Tchaikovsky comes another guy that I like. His name is Anton Devorshak. He's another Czechoslovakian composer. But what makes him so important, and you'll notice, is that he came to America and he chaired the New York Conservatory of Music, and while there, he basically said, where is American music? And there was no American music. You had Stephen Foster and some guys like that writing songs, but there was no major romantic composers in America. And so him being a Czechoslovakian, he goes out to Iowa, where there's this big Czechoslovakian community. In the summertime, he spends his summer there. And if you know anything about Iowa, that's sort of on the tip of Sioux Indian land. And so he gets to meet and visit with the Sioux Indians, and he falls in love with their music. It's a lot of drum rhythms and a lot of whistles. He goes down the Mississippi to New Orleans, where he runs into American spirituals, black spirituals, and he said, this is it. And he goes back to New York, and he tells the composers he's training, he says, gentlemen, you have a very rich national sound. You see, America was inhabited by Europeans, so we had brought that sound with us. But once here, we began to develop our own sound, and our uniqueness was in jazz. That was the true American form, but also in Native American sound. And so he wrote a symphony, Symphony Number 9, called the New World Symphony in E minor. And he dedicated it to America, and he uses spirituals and a lot of flutes and sounds like that he says come from the Indians. Now, I'll be honest with you, I've listened to that symphony over and over, and I can't hear the spirituals. He says that Swing Low, Sweet Chariot's one of the main themes. I've yet to hear it. But I do get that sense of spiritual music and also of Indian influence. So Dvorak does that. But what's important was teaching in New York, he taught this to a lot of composers, and suddenly America begins to blossom and flower, and we become a center of music. From America, you're going to have the Gershwins, the Stravinskys, the John Cages, the Schoenbergs, the Coplands, who's one of my favorites. But that's where it's going. I will introduce you to a guy named Gabriel Fauré, who wrote some of this beautiful music, but it's very underrated. But his thing was that his musical compositions had a romantic style that everybody copied. So even though Fauré, who is, I mean, he is well known, just not super well known, inspired a lot of 20th century composers. Then another one of my favorites is an English composer by the name of Edvard Elgar. If you listen to nothing, listen to Elgar's Enigma Variations to understand him. He's an incredible composer. He will inspire people like Benjamin Britten. We'll talk about them later. But Elgar was another of those interesting people. And finally, we end the late Romantic with sort of like Beethoven took us from classical to Romantic. Debussy is going to take us from late Romantic into a whole new realm of 20th century music. He writes what he calls impressionistic music. He borrows the idea from art, an impressionistic artist, and he tries to do in music what the artists do, impressionistic artists do on canvas, and that is to give you an idea of something without making it blatantly obvious. Debussy is an interesting guy. Now, I read one of his bios where it said that when he was in Paris at the conservatory, all his professors hated him because he said he was better than they, and a lot of times he was, but he didn't make a secret about it, sort of like Mozart did with some of his teachers. Debussy seemed to have had quite an ego problem, but he didn't care because he thought he was really great. And his Impressionism was new, and he inspired a guy named Maurice Ravel. Ravel was an interesting guy, too. I know you're tired of me saying everybody's interesting, but Ravel was such a rebel that he formed a group of guys called Les Apaches, or Apaches, or what they translated as hooligans. And they went around and they were very disrespectful to their teachers, and they were literally hooligans. Very rough guys, but they were composers. And they wrote music, and Debussy didn't particularly like them. But those two guys were writing the same impressionistic style. Now, after Ravel, we move into 20th century music, which I flirt with it here, but we're going to do a whole section on the 20th century because it starts with a thing called Expressionism. You had Impressionism, but now you're going to go to Expressionism, which Expressionism is a little different because it deals more with emotional experience and not reality or physical reality. And that's similar to Impressionism, but Impressionism tries to take reality and sort of cloak it, whereas Expressionism takes reality and strips away all of, I'm saying this backwards, takes away the physicalness of the reality to get to the emotional part of it. And you got guys like Schoenberg and Webern and Berg, Stravinsky. These are some of these people. I'll give you a little taste of Stravinsky because he's pretty big. But what they do is they usher in what we call 20th century music. People say we're out of the Romantic and we go into the 20th century, but in fact, the 20th century style of music is just an extension of a Romanticism with a new harmony. And it doesn't last very long because, quite frankly, people don't like it. It's liked. There are certain pieces that are enjoyed, but overall, it just didn't work out. But what happened was that's about the time that motion pictures became vogue. And if you go to a movie today, you will listen to the soundtrack, and what you're hearing are a blending of Romanticism, pop music, and 20th century music. Because 20th century music is what's the sounds that are used to affect the scene. I think of the scene in Psycho where the lady's in the shower and a guy comes and stabs her, and you use this 20th century type harmony to create a sound effect. And it's just, it doesn't sound like a knife, it doesn't sound like a shower, it's just this weird sound that people have said it's the most horrifying scene ever put into a movie. That's up to you. but the music becomes important in expressing our feelings. And I still think today that we are in a period of emotionalism. We have lost a lot of the sense of logic and reason, because instead of asking what is truth and what is right, we ask, how does it make you feel? And if it makes you feel bad, then it's bad. But that's a dangerous road to go down. We'll talk more about that when we get to 20th century. But anyway, I wanted to give you a heads up on what you've just done and what you're getting ready to do with this Romantic. Now, I'm going to post the late Romantic composers and PowerPoint. Should get it posted today. So take a look at this video, take a look at the PowerPoint, and listen to the examples. You're going to hear some sounds that you've heard before, usually in movies, but you never heard them in any of these previous periods. So I think you'll begin to enjoy this music a little more. So that's for Introduction to Music class, and I hope to talk with you again soon. All right, thanks again. Bye-bye.